Hello and welcome. Today, we begin a fascinating journey through the history of America. This is a special lesson for listening and speaking practice, and I promise to make it easy, fun, and interesting. By the end of this series, you will know everything important about America, its discovery, its struggles, its people, and why it is one of the most powerful countries in the world today. Let's start with the big question. How did it all begin? The first people and the great discovery. A long, long time ago, around 15,000 years ago, the first people lived on this land. They were the Native American tribes, and they were the first people to call America home. These tribes were hunters and gatherers. They traveled across a land bridge from Asia to North America a very long time ago, when the oceans were lower. They lived in harmony with nature, growing crops like corn and beans, hunting animals like buffalo, and building their own unique cultures and communities. But the story of America as we know it starts much later, in 1492. An Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain. He was looking for a new route to Asia, a faster way to travel for trade. But instead of reaching Asia, he landed in the Americas, on an island in the Caribbean Sea. This journey was funded by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus was so sure he had reached India that he called the native people living there Indians. This is why Native Americans are sometimes still called Indians, even though it was a mistake. However, Columbus wasn't truly the first European to reach America. Nearly 500 years earlier, the Vikings, led by a brave explorer named Leif Erikson, landed in what is now Canada. But their settlements were small and didn't last long. So, Columbus is often credited with discovering America because his journey brought permanent and widespread European attention to this new continent. The European rush and the first colonies. After Columbus's successful journey, more and more explorers came from Europe. Countries like Spain, France, and England sent ships across the ocean to claim land in this new world. Spain focused on South and Central America, where they found huge amounts of gold and silver. This made Spain very rich. England and France were more interested in building colonies in North America. These European settlers brought many changes to the land and its people. They introduced new foods, like wheat and sugar, new animals, like horses and cows, and new technologies, like metal tools. But they also brought something terrible, diseases like smallpox. The Native Americans had no immunity to these European diseases, and sadly, millions of them died. This was the beginning of a very complex and often painful relationship between the settlers and the native people. In 1607, England established its first permanent colony in America. It was called Jamestown, and it was in the state of Virginia. The first settlers faced many problems. The winters were harsh and cold, they suffered from diseases, and there was often a lack of food. But they were strong, and they survived. Soon, more colonies were formed, and people from Europe started moving to America in search of a better life. One of the most famous groups of early settlers was the Pilgrims. They came to America in 1620 on a ship called the Mayflower. They were escaping religious persecution in England. They wanted the freedom to worship God in their own way. They landed in what is now the state of Massachusetts. Their first winter was very difficult, and many of them died. But the local Native Americans, the Wampanoag tribe, helped them. They taught the Pilgrims how to grow corn and survive in the new land. To celebrate their first successful harvest, the Pilgrims, and the Native Americans shared a big feast. This was the first Thanksgiving. Life in the 13 colonies. By the 1700s, America had become a land of opportunity. People came from all over Europe because they believed they could find freedom, land, and a new life here. But this new beginning wasn't easy. Different countries were fighting for control of America, especially England, France, and Spain. By the 1700s, England had established 13 colonies along the east coast of what is now the United States. These colonies were divided into three main regions. First, the New England colonies, like Massachusetts and Connecticut. These colonies were known for their thick forests, their fishing industries, and their small farms. The community was very important here, and people often worked together. Second, the middle colonies, like New York and Pennsylvania. These colonies were known as the breadbasket because they grew lots of wheat and grain, which provided food for many other colonies. There were also many different cultures and religions here, and it was a more tolerant place. Third, the southern colonies, like Virginia and Georgia. These colonies had large farms called plantations. Crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton were grown on these plantations. Much of the hard work on these plantations was done by enslaved people from Africa. This was a tragic and cruel part of America's history, a dark shadow over the idea of a land of freedom. Life in the colonies was not easy. People had to build their own homes, grow their own food, and survive harsh winters. Families worked very hard, and children often helped their parents on the farm or in the family business. Schools were rare, and only a few children, usually boys from rich families, learned to read or write. But the colonies were also full of hope. People came here because they wanted religious freedom, their own land, and opportunities they didn't have in Europe. Conflict with Britain. Even though the colonies were in America, they were still ruled by Britain. The King of England, King George III, made the laws for the colonies, and the colonists had to pay high taxes to Britain. These taxes were on things like tea, paper, and glass. The colonists started to feel very angry. They didn't have anyone to represent them in the British government. They had no voice in making the laws or the taxes they had to pay. So they started a protest with a famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." This meant they didn't want to pay taxes unless they could have a voice in the government. One famous example of this anger was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. To protest a tax on tea, a group of colonists dressed up like Native Americans. They snuck onto British ships in the Boston harbor at night and threw 342 boxes of tea into the water. This was a bold act of rebellion against the king. The road to independence. By the mid-1700s, the colonists were tired of being controlled by Britain. They wanted to be free to make their own laws and their own decisions. In 1775, a war began between the American colonies and Britain. This was called the American Revolutionary War. The colonists were led by brave leaders. George Washington, a wealthy farmer from Virginia, became the commander of the American army. He was a great leader and inspired his soldiers. Another important figure was Thomas Jefferson, who was a brilliant writer. He wrote a very famous document called the Declaration of Independence. This document, written on July 4, 1776, declared that the 13 colonies were no longer part of Britain. It was a letter to the king and to the world, saying that the colonies were now free and independent states. The document also said something revolutionary. that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a bold and dangerous move. It meant the colonies were now at full war with one of the most powerful countries in the world. The war was tough. The British Army was big, well-trained, and had lots of weapons and ships. The American colonists were just farmers, shopkeepers, and regular people with very little training. But they had something very important: a strong belief in their cause and a powerful desire for freedom. They also received crucial help from France, which provided soldiers, weapons, and ships. After years of fighting, the Americans finally won a major victory at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain officially recognized the United States of America as an independent country. A new nation is born. After the war, the leaders of the new country had a big job to do. They needed to create a government. They wrote the Constitution, which is a set of rules for how the country should work. It created a government with 3 parts: a president, a Congress, and a court system. They also elected George Washington as the first president of the United States in 1789. This was the beginning of a new country, built on the ideas of freedom, equality, and democracy. However, it is important to remember that these ideas didn't apply to everyone at the time. Enslaved people, women, and Native Americans were not treated equally, and it would take many more years of struggle to make progress toward true equality for all. Expansion and a growing nation. Now that the United States of America was born, it was time to grow. But this growth wasn't simple. It involved new opportunities, difficult challenges, and the dark chapter of slavery. After the War of Independence, the United States was still small. It was made up of just 13 states along the East Coast. But Americans had big dreams. They wanted to expand westward and explore the vast lands of North America. In 1803, something extraordinary happened. President Thomas Jefferson bought a huge piece of land from France. This was called the Louisiana Purchase, and it doubled the size of the United States overnight. This land stretched from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It opened up endless opportunities for farming, trade, and exploration. To learn more about this new land, Jefferson sent 2 explorers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, on a long journey. With the help of a Native American woman named Sacagawea, they traveled across rivers, mountains, and plains, mapping the land and meeting Native American tribes. The idea of moving west became very popular. It was called Manifest Destiny. Many Americans believed it was their destiny, or their fate, to spread across the entire continent. Families packed all their belongings into covered wagons and traveled for months to find new homes in the West. They faced many dangers, like harsh weather, wild animals, and difficult terrain. However, this expansion wasn't fair to everyone. Native American tribes were forced off their lands and pushed onto small areas called reservations. This led to many conflicts and a deep sense of loss for the native peoples, whose way of life was forever changed. A divided nation, the rise of slavery. As America grew, so did its economy. The southern states became very wealthy because of their large plantations that grew crops like cotton and tobacco. But this wealth came at a terrible cost. The plantation owners used enslaved Africans to do all the hard labor. These enslaved people were kidnapped from their homes in Africa and brought to America in horrifying conditions on slave ships. Slavery was a brutal and cruel system. Enslaved people were treated as property, not as human beings. They worked long hours in the fields, often under the hot sun, and lived in terrible conditions. Families were torn apart and sold to different owners. Enslaved people had no rights and no freedom. By the mid-1800s, America was divided into two regions with very different views on slavery. In the North, most people believed slavery was morally wrong. They wanted to end it and give everyone a chance to live freely. Many Northerners worked in factories or owned small farms, so they didn't rely on enslaved labor. In the South, the economy depended completely on slavery. Plantation owners argued that their wealth and success would collapse without the free labor of enslaved workers. This disagreement grew stronger and stronger. People in the North and South started to feel like they were living in two completely different countries. Many brave individuals fought against slavery. Some of the most famous were the abolitionists, people who worked to end slavery in America. One of the most inspiring figures was Harriet Tubman. She was an escaped slave who became a leader in the Underground Railroad. This wasn't a real railroad, but a secret network of people and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. Another important figure was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a powerful writer and speaker. He shared his story with the world and showed the horrors of slavery through his words. The Civil War. By the 1860s, the tension between the North and South reached a breaking point. The Southern states wanted to keep slavery, while the Northern states wanted to stop it from spreading to new states. In 1861, the Southern states decided to leave the United States and form their own country, called the Confederacy. This started a terrible and bloody conflict called the Civil War. The Civil War was one of the darkest times in American history. It lasted from 1861 to 1865 and caused immense suffering. Soldiers fought in bloody battles. Families were torn apart, sometimes fighting against their own cousins. Entire towns were destroyed. But the war also brought hope for change. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln, who led the North, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were now free. This was a major turning point in the war and in American history. After years of fighting, the North won the Civil War in 1865. The Southern states rejoined the United States, and slavery was officially abolished forever with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This was a huge step forward for freedom, but the journey toward true equality was far from over. A new century, industry, depression, and war. During the late 1800s, America experienced a massive transformation. This period is called the Industrial Revolution. It was a time when machines and factories changed the way people worked and lived. Instead of farming, many people began working in cities, building railroads, making steel, and creating new inventions. Inventions like the telephone, thanks to Alexander Graham Bell, and electricity, thanks to inventors like Thomas Edison, changed daily life. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, millions of immigrants came to America from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. They came through places like Ellis Island in New York, hoping for a better life. They worked hard, believing in the American dream, the idea that anyone could succeed in America with hard work and determination. The 1920s were a time of fun and excitement, called the Roaring Twenties. But by 1929, the good times ended. The stock market crashed, and businesses went bankrupt. This started the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. Millions of people lost their jobs. In 1933, a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, took office. He created a series of programs called the New Deal to help people and rebuild the economy. In the 1930s, while America was recovering, trouble was growing in Europe and Asia. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, was trying to take over Europe. World War II began in 1939. At first, America stayed out of the war. But on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked a U.S. naval base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. This attack shocked the nation, and the next day America declared war. America's involvement helped win the war in 1945. After World War II, America became one of the most powerful countries in the world. The Cold War and the fight for civil rights. After World War II, the world was divided into two main powers. One was the United States, which believed in democracy and capitalism. The other was the Soviet Union, USSR, which believed in communism. This rivalry was called the Cold War because it wasn't a direct war with armies, but a competition fought with ideas, technology, and influence. The two countries competed to explore space in the space race. In 1969, the U.S. became the first country to land astronauts on the moon. While America was growing stronger on the world stage, it still had deep problems at home, especially racism and inequality. In the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans, inspired by leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., fought for their rights in a movement called the Civil Rights Movement. They used peaceful protests like marches and boycotts. One of the most famous events was the March on Washington in 1963, where over 250,000 people gathered in Dr. King gave his powerful "I Have a Dream" speech. This movement led to important laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination based on race. Modern America: power, diversity, and the future. Today, America is known as one of the most powerful and influential countries in the world. Its economy is the largest in the world, with leading companies in technology. Its military is one of the most advanced, and its culture, movies, music, and fashion is famous everywhere. One of America's greatest strengths is its diversity. People from all over the world live in America, bringing their languages, food, traditions, ideas, and dreams, making America a beautiful mix of cultures. This diversity is celebrated in many festivals and is a source of the country's creativity and innovation. However, America still faces challenges, just like any country. Racism, while much less than in the past, still exists. Income inequality is a problem, as some people are very rich while others struggle to pay for basic needs like healthcare. And like all countries, America faces the global challenge of climate change. America's future is full of possibilities. Young people are passionate about making the world better, working on issues like equality, technology, and the environment. America is not a perfect country, but it is a country built on hope, dreams, and hard work. Its history shows that struggles can lead to growth, and that diversity makes a nation stronger. The story of America is still being written by its people, who continue to dream, innovate, and fight for a better tomorrow.